Right, Jaron, I have to ask you because
Yes.
because I watched it, and maybe you've told this story before, and I don't know how you feel about it. You were in this movie that came out on Netflix, right? What was it called? Behind the Curve, Over the
Behind the
Curve,
curve. Yeah.
Behind the Curve, right? And it featured Mark Sargent mostly, Patricia Steer, right? That's mostly what it was about, and then you and Bob were in it. You guys do Globebusters, and and they show you do a few experiments. I mean, oh, first of all, what did you think? What did you think of the way that turned out? Why did you decide to do it? Tell us about that thing.
How did I feel about the movie? I felt, it really kind of told me a lot about the mainstream media. And I'm not saying that they're mainstream, but what I'm saying is how desperate everyone is to prove the globe. So desperate, in fact, that I basically was set up for, lack of a better way to explain it. They, called me out of the blue and basically said, "Hey, can we come film your experiment?" I said, "Sure, sounds great." In fact, they said, "We have a whole crew. It'll be 3 or 4 people come out. We have cameras, we have lights, we have drones. It's going to make it look real nice." And I said, "Fantastic. I don't want to have to film it myself. I want to be there conducting the experiment, um, not, worrying about filming." So I said, "Yeah, sure, come on by." So they came out and filmed it. And I was a little reluctant about signing anything. And they wanted me to sign this release. And they said, "Oh, man, everything's going to be on the up and up. There's going to be, we're really trying to show flat Earth in a positive light. We want to show people, the people behind it. We want to be real honest. We're going to, everything about the movie is going to be honest."
They said that they wanted to portray it in a positive light. They actually said that.
Yeah, that they wanted to show the people behind flat Earth, and
Right.
they wanted to do it justice. And they said that, everything would be on the up and up. They had to keep talking about it. They had to keep telling me because the fact was that they came to my experiment twice. The first time we kept the laser on too long, it ended up melting the expander. We had like a beam expander at the end of it, and because we had the laser on too long, it melted it on there, caused a problem, and we had to shut down the experiment the first night. So in between the first experiment and second experiment was the Flat Earth International conference, and they were there at that event. And I remember specifically them basically like following me around, trying over and over again to get me to sign this document. They really wanted me to sign, and it was like an NDA, right? Or basically granting them permission to use all the footage. And I kept telling them, well, especially because the first experiment failed. I said, the first experiment failed, and I don't want you guys to use it. Like, you're not going to show a movie where here's this flat earther trying to prove the curve and his experiment failed.
Mm-hmm.
And they said, no, we're not going to do that. No, that's not the point. We were filming it because we, want to see results. We want to see good results. So the second time we did the experiment, even the experiment that we were trying to do didn't end up being the experiment that took place.
Mm-hmm.
We kind of came up with one on the spot, and we still weren't able to see anything. There was like 22 people at this experiment, and I'd say 4 of them or 5 of them were globe believers. And we all walked away from the experiment saying nothing was proven, nothing was shown. It was just too hard to see, and the laser beam wasn't kept at the diameter that we needed to prove anything. And other than that, we had some observations that could have gone either way.
Right.
So
Let me explain because I
Sure.
watched it, and let me try to explain to the audience like what they showed, at least as
Okay.
far as the movie goes. You're trying to shine a laser from one post to another post, right? Far enough apart that the curvature of the earth should make it so that the laser didn't, didn't hit the other thing, kind of, right? Is that basically the experiment?
Sure. That's the one that didn't work.
That's the one
Yes.
that they show. That's why I remember seeing the movie that they showed it didn't work, right?
Well, see, this is how tricky that movie was, and this is how, because you remember there being a post, and we're trying to shine a laser to hit the other side, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, but at the end of the movie, there was a moment. They ended the movie with me saying "interesting," right?
Mm-hmm.
Because all of a sudden we saw some light. Do you remember
Right.
that at the end of the
Right.
movie?
And that the way they portrayed it was
Right.
that the light shone too high, which meant that there actually is a curve. That's the way it was portrayed, basically.
Correct.
Yeah.
Right. And you have to remember that's not even the same experiment,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because
Oh,
we're not
right.
shining a laser. There's no laser. There's no 2 posts. That experiment didn't work. So what they
Oh.
did is they used a scene from when we were just down there, and we just had the guy at the very far end. Remember, we're talking to somebody that's 3 miles away.
Right.
And we're telling him basically when the laser doesn't work, because basically what would happen is by the time it got to him, the beam was too big. The beam was like 8-foot circle. So we're trying to get it to hit a backboard that's about 8 feet tall. And if you have an 8-foot circle, it kind of defeats the point, right? We're trying to keep the beam at a certain diameter. We needed it to be about, a foot.
Right.
A foot circle, not 8 foot. It takes up the whole thing.
Right.
So when that didn't work, we just started telling the person at the far end, hey, hold up a flashlight, hold it at your chest, hold it at your waist, hold it above your head. Just different heights, trying to see what we could see from 3 miles away through a little circle in a panel that's halfway between both of us. And at times we saw the light when it was at his chest. At times we saw it when it was at his waist. It kind of just depended, almost like we were seeing reflections. We didn't know. But at one point in the whole experiment, I said to him, okay, hold it at your chest. And he holds it at his chest, and we said, okay, we don't see it. Then we said, hold it above your head. Then he held it above his head, and I said, oh, interesting. Now, at the same time, there were other scenes, there was other moments where we would say, hold it above your head, and we wouldn't be able to see it. Hold it at your chest. Oh, now we do see it. So what I was saying interesting too is the fact that we were just getting different results altogether, that there was nothing proven. So all 22 of us walk away from that experiment saying nothing was proven. Believe me, if we had looked across and said, hold it at your chest, and we saw nothing, hold it above your head. Wow, we see the light now. Hold it back at your chest. Hold it above your head. Walk away, come back, do it again. And it kept repeating itself. That's something interesting, right? That's something that everybody would have walked away and said, wow, it looks like the results proved globe tonight, right? Somebody would have said that. But no, instead, everybody walks away from the experiment thinking nothing was proven. We saw shit all over the board. The experiment didn't work. End of story. Even the producer of the movie was like, oh man, sorry, nothing panned out tonight. Yeah. I felt bad because they'd come out and bring out a whole movie crew, right? A whole crew of guys with lights and all kinds of stuff. And we felt that we failed everything. Mm-hmm. So I didn't think that we were going to be in the movie, period. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Because I said, well, the experiment wasn't shown. I told them, you're not going to show the experiment as if we failed it, right? So when we failed the second night, I said, well, they're not going to show that. They're just not going to put that in the movie. But I had already signed the documentation. So when I heard that they had a movie, and then I think Patricia Steer, Mark Sargent, one of them was the first one to see it. They basically called me and said, oh, you're never going to believe what they put in the movie from your experiment. They put it that you proved the globe. I'm like, how? What do you mean? They said, well, the experiment ends with you saying interesting. Like, I don't even know what I remember. I hadn't seen it at this point. I'm like, I don't even know what you're talking about. What do you mean saying interesting? And they said, well, you're looking through your camera and somebody holds up a light above their head and you say interesting. And I'm like, well, that's going to look ridiculous on the movie. People are going to easily see that it's not an experiment, that we didn't do an experiment. Well, I didn't know that they were like going to cut it up like that. Right. So when I go back and watch that, it was one of the biggest things for me. And here's the thing. I don't expect anybody, unless they were one of the 22 people that were there or myself, to understand what I'm talking about. Right. Because once you've seen the movie, you are going to have one thing in your head about how those 2 nights went down. In fact, most people I've talked to didn't even understand that those were 2 different nights. The other thing they didn't understand, kind of like what you said, you're like, okay, so the experiment was you're going to shine a laser and you're going to try and shoot it across. So that is the experiment. And that experiment failed. So what they showed at the end were some observations that were just being made at the end, and nobody thought they proved anything.
Well, let me interrupt again just to tell people what they made it look like from somebody who didn't know the story and was just watching the movie. They made it look like there was one experiment, and they made it look like it wasn't just that the experiment failed or you weren't able to prove what you wanted to prove. It was literally that the result, instead of being, this is the way they made it seem from what you explained happened, that the result was that the laser was supposed to hit one point and it was higher, which meant that there's which would confirm a globe, basically. And then they show you saying interesting, as if you're what do you kind of interpret from it? It's like you're saying, oh, weird, oh, maybe the earth is a globe or something like that, and then you walk away, and then they show you like kind of dejectedly.
It was super deceptive. Yeah. I walked away I knew what happened, and I walked away like they made it look like we had evidence that denied flat earth, and he was looking for a way to explain it away. Right. And then they just cut, and that was the end of the movie. So
So here's the interesting part about that. Many different things. I mean, wouldn't they have shown more of the conversation that would have happened after that? Would have been great to have cameras on me as I just prove who do I talk to next? Who comes up to me and says, Jaron, what does this mean? Who comes over from the side and says, Jaron, is this proof of the globe? I mean, did you just prove the globe? All that was left out, right? So on top of that, here's the thing that a lot of people don't know, and I've voiced this that I think is hilarious, is when I heard that they were going to record this event, I even asked them, hey, can I get the footage after you're done? They said, well, we are filming a documentary. We can't give you the footage that we use in the documentary, but we can give you the other footage. I said, okay, great. So when I saw this movie came out, I'm like, oh man, this is hilarious because I'll be able to show them, I'll be able to show people, show that whole sequence of events, right? Show that observation was taken out of the middle, completely out of context. This will be great. So I contacted them and said, hey, I want that other footage now. And they said, oh, due to contractual obligations with Netflix, we're not allowed to give you any of the footage. I said, you promised me that you would give me the footage. And they said, yeah, that was before we signed with Netflix. And Netflix says we can't give you, which is just ridiculous. Think about that. They have footage that they didn't put in their documentary that for some reason Netflix won't allow them to give me. Well, of course, the reason why is because I'd be able to easily show that they took that experiment or they took that moment out of sequence and it meant nothing. And their whole movie would be down the drain. They would be exposed as frauds. So it was, it's just funny that that was their new thing. And they talked to me and said, man, we're sorry you don't agree with the assessment of the documentary, but this is the way our producer saw it. So they're kind of telling me this is the producer saw it that way, and that's why he portrayed it that way. But I said, yeah, but how come nobody else at the experiment, including 4 or 5 people that believe in the globe, how come they didn't walk away and say the globe was proven? How come the only person out of the 22 people there was the movie producer, and he didn't say anything at the time? Well, and they say, well, that's just the way it goes, and this was our documentary. Also, what people don't realize about that documentary is those guys have admitted to saying, Dave, do you remember them saying that their plan was to have a documentary that was pro-Flat Earth until they got to the Flat Earth Convention? Do you remember that whole thing? Yeah. So once they got to the Flat Earth Conference, they saw children there at the conference. Parents had brought their children, families go. It's a fun event. Right. They said when they saw that children were there and that were standing up and asking questions in Q&A sessions, that they changed their mind completely and wanted to portray Flat Earth in a negative way. So they've admitted
that's what they said. That's not like a rumor. Correct. That's what they actually said. So they were so worried for the youngsters having their minds polluted by this Flat Earth garbage that they decided that instead of just reporting on it and being fun about it, that they needed to take a stand and put a narrative and basically put a spin on it.
Right. And then, it depends on how you look at how that spin was placed there. But by taking things that Bob said, which again, they did an experiment, and I don't know anything about this experiment. When it gets to some of that science stuff, it's above my head when you're talking about ring laser or laser fiber optic gyros. Bob and the FE Core team, and not even Bob, he never touched the experiment either, but the FE Core, somebody with FE Core has some $15,000 or $20,000 fiber optic gyroscope, which he used to measure and says that he found a 15-degree rotation. Now, whether that's the Earth or whether that's the sky, this is the argument that goes all the way back as 100 years, right? To these guys who, Sanyak and Michelson Morley, who did these experiments, Aries failure, they've all had the same question as to what is going on. Is the sky moving? Is the Earth moving? Of course, we know Einstein and people like that have said that there is no experiment that can prove whether the Earth moves. Now, when these experiments are done, you'll have one or the other. You'll either have flat Earth people or geocentric, non-rotating Earth people who will say, no, this test is actually showing the sky is moving. And then you'll have the same test be interpreted by the other team saying, no, this proves the Earth moves.
Let me break in here again, just to explain it the way it shows up in the movie, is that Bob, who's the co-host of Globebusters with you, gets this really expensive gyroscope, this really expensive sensor, which supposedly can detect, would be able to detect the spin of the Earth. And maybe there are even 2 of them, one more expensive than the other. And it finds the amount, it basically finds a spin. and it finds the exact amount that it should be if it was spinning. And is that about right? And then this is the way it seemed in the movie, okay? And then
Right.
he basically, the conclusion was that he still didn't think that the Earth was spinning, and he needed to do maybe a different test to be able
Right.
to see whether it's actually, the spin could be created because the Earth is spinning, or it could be created because everything's spinning around the Earth.
Well, since then they've done tests too at different altitudes, because they figured if the Earth were spinning, then at different altitudes they should get a different rate, whatever, they should get the same rate. And what they did is did different altitudes, basically doing it from ground level, then up on a high mountain in Colorado, and found that there was a different turn rate. So what they're saying is that that's the sky moving, not the ground moving. So anyway, that was, yeah, what you're saying is basically right, that Bob said, yeah, we found this 15-degree. And everyone says, oh, Bob proved. I mean, Bob, the thing that wasn't even said there, Bob never has touched that device. He'd never even seen the device. It was something that somebody else had done, and he was just commenting on that. And of course, they used that to show, yes, hey, this guy proved curve. They used me to show that that Bob had proved spin, I had proved curve. And so for both of us to see that, like I said, it was just huge for me. I mean, I was just like, of all things, why would you need to misrepresent my experiment?
Nathan, but they very often use results to favor their bias. For example, sticks and shadows prove that the Earth is a ball, but they never realize that straight sticks and straight shadows with a close local sun produce the same result. 2 + 2 is 4. That's it. There's no other way to get to 4. Therefore, 2 + 2 is the only answer. Well, that's ridiculous. 1 + 1 + 1 + 1 + 1, 3 + 1. There's many ways to get to 4. So they'll just take the one thing. Boats go over the curve of the horizon because it disappear from the bottom up because of the curvature. Well, if the Earth was curved, then that would happen. But there's a whole bunch of other reasons it happens, and it varies day to day.
Right.
So when we see over and over again them doing this, I mean, that's led a lot to my belief, because it would be very easy for them, in my opinion, to, if it were a globe, to just prove it's a globe. And they don't do that. They can never do that. They have to use lies. They have to use the same old thing that they've said every time, boats over the curve. They never mention the fact that, oh yeah, all of a sudden people are zooming in and seeing way too far. They've got an answer for everything, right? If you're seeing buildings over Lake Michigan, well, that's a mirage. Right. Even though mirages flip upside down, even though they invert, even though they're basically fluttered, we don't see that in these observations. In fact, people take time lapses and the thing's there all day, or people drive across the lake and show you from the beginning to the end that the thing doesn't change. Then you've got like Stephen Hawking's Genius video, which is the PBS special or whatever, National Geographic, I forgot which one it is, I think PBS, where he basically takes a helicopter and flies it 6 miles away, and it supposedly goes below the curve. And we've proven outright that entire video is a fraud. We've actually shown it. So this is the kind of thing I'm talking about, where if it were real and the Earth were really a globe and you could really just go out with these tools that they have and prove it, then you wouldn't need to fabricate those results. The fabrication, to me, screams fraud. And this is the only way they have. I mean, in that video, they talk about, oh, we're going to take 3 ordinary people. Well, all you have to do is a little bit of research to find out those aren't ordinary people. One of them's a school teacher. Okay, I'll call that an ordinary person. The other person in the actual video says, oh, I figured this out and I figured out this out. And I'm not a scientist, but blah, blah, blah. But we found out that she is a scientist. That's what her job is. And then the other person works for NASA. She's a NASA Goddard artist. So these are the 3 people that video tried to portray as being ordinary people, proving that the Earth is a globe. So all these things combined, plus what they did during Behind the Curve. And again, people like Mark Sargent or Patricia, I think that they portrayed them honestly, right? Because they were kind of doing a background love story kind of thing. There was no experiment for them to really show anything differently. But with Bob and I, they just used deception to sway people's minds, and we get it all the time. I get people who still write me to this day, why you keep up with this flat earth stuff? You already proved the curve. So the movie did its job.
Yeah, right. No kidding. Well, one thing you realize, I watched it not knowing exactly what the angle was or anything, And one thing that you can tell it's disingenuous about all of the people who try to debunk flat Earth is they don't address the actual real things. You know, that like they didn't address the fact, even though it's called behind the curve, they don't address the fact that there is no curve, and that there are experiments like the boat disappearing over the horizon. You just get a zoom, get a telescope or a zoom lens, it reappears. You know, you can see things way further. Forget the fact that you go up at 30,000 feet and everything's still flat. You know, I mean, it would be one thing I would love anybody to just say, oh, well, these are some questions that
Nathan,
these people have.
120,000 feet, it's still flat.
Right
Behind me.
You get Neil deGrasse, who will get up in front of entire auditoriums and tell people, you know, hey, you see this Felix Baumgartner doing his Red Bull jump, and he said people see this curve and they think that that's the curve of the Earth. He's like, no, that's a fisheye lens that from 120,000 feet, all you would be able to see is flatness. Mm-hmm. He says that flat out. Yet all you hear from mainstream news, from interviews, whatever, is you'll hear people saying they can see it from the plane. I can see a curve from the plane. I can see it from the top of this mountain. I can see it from Mount Everest. And none of those things are anywhere near mathematically correct, scientifically correct. Yet people will just scream them. And this is what I'm talking about, is if we're going to be honest about things, let's be honest about things. Whereas that's never the case. It's like, again, people would say, well, if the Earth was flat, the sun would burn everybody alive. Like, what are you talking about? Nobody thinks that the sun is 867,000 miles wide. Or they'll say if the Earth was flat, gravity would be stronger in the center than it would be at the edges. Well, again, you're basing something off of the globe view that there's a force in the center.
They mix the flat Earth model and they put it in a heliocentric universe and say it's stupid. And you're right, it is stupid in a heliocentric universe, but we don't live there. We live inside the Earth system. The Earth is all there is, and everything we see in the sky is within that system.
Right. Well, we're going to get there. But I've heard people say that too. They're like, oh, I've seen the curve from a plane. And I think to myself, what? How did you do that?
There's several reasons that you see a curve from a plane. Okay. One of them is indoctrination.
You are listening right now to a pretty epic radio show, something you really actually probably can't hear anywhere else in the known universe. And it's happening live right now. That is Midnight in the Desert with me, Nathan Stoltman, and joining me tonight is Jaron of Jeranism and David Weiss, DITRH.
You're willing to talk about things that matter. You're willing to talk about things that are uncomfortable. And some people just count on their voice.
Well, this is cool. I was just thinking about it. I was like, this is actually really special. This stuff doesn't actually happen. So,
I am not in space on a balloon. This is a green screen behind me. And when we talk about things that people are wondering what the flat Earth is about, I bring up pictures. So we were going to have your board ops guy pop the pictures in, but it's kind of just easy for me to throw them up behind me if necessary. But you were just talking about curvature. There's no curvature no matter how high you go. So if we want to talk about flat Earth a little bit, you said, you implied, I'm a little unsure where you stand, that you don't think the Earth is flat. Is that correct?
It's
okay
really
to say I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know. I will say this. It looks flat. It acts flat. For all intents and purposes, it may as well be flat. The way we interact with it and everything.
So
some things like satellites, I just don't know. I'm not convinced they're just balloons. So
they could be balloons. They could be bouncing off the firmament. They could be attached to the firmament. They could be something else. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of could be. So I say satellites don't count. But believing that a satellite can fall around the Earth while the Earth is going sideways at 66,000 miles per hour, forward at over 500,000 miles per hour, while the whole universe travels 2.2 million miles an hour in another direction, and the satellite can just fall perfectly around it, makes no sense to me. Makes no sense to anybody that actually thinks about it. My question to you, Nathan.
Go ahead.
What makes you think you live on a ball? Just one reason. That's all I want.
I don't, I don't have one really. I mean, the only thing
Isn't
is the
that odd?
satellite thing is that I understand theoretically, like you can draw a picture where you shoot out a satellite, it stays at a constant speed and it falls towards Earth, and it falls towards Earth at exactly the same rate that Earth is falling away from it. And somehow, so like it kind of theoretically, it makes sense
But
that
you have to remember that the Earth is moving, so when the satellite comes up the other side, it's got to catch up to the Earth.
I'm just saying, like, yeah, forget all the other problems, but I
There's
have trouble.
too many problems.
Right.
The question I ask people that say, "I believe we live on a ball," I say, "Can you give me one reason you believe it?" Otherwise, it's a complete religion. It's just a religion, a religious belief.
Right. I'm
I,
definitely, I can't tell you one thing that convinces me for sure. In fact, the only thing, maybe I'm easy because the only thing I know for sure is that it's definitely not what they tell us it is.
That people need to recognize that we've been lied to about everything, right? And if you've been lied to about everything, even things that you can go verify, and we know that the mainstream media lies about things that happened yesterday, that they lie about things happening now. So they lie about everything. So why would the one thing that everybody tells the truth be about places you can't go and things you'll never verify for yourself? And it's a very fantastic, storybook kind of thing when you talk about outer space. And I think it's best described as Narnia, because once you start talking to people about what is behind the wardrobe, you're able to say whatever you want. That telescopes can actually see back in time. I mean, this is what they believe. They believe that when you look, not even telescopes, if you go outside right now, it's nighttime, and if you look up and see a star, the light that you're actually seeing is 4 years. You're looking at it 4 years ago. If it's 4 light years away, if it's 100 light years away, you're looking at light 100 years ago. These are just fantastic stories. They're distances that nobody can prove.
I love those stories.
They're so great. They really make me feel all warm and cozy inside. But I mean, when they've just convinced the world of things that are not provable in any way, and you have so many people out there that will believe that they are spinning, and it goes against everything. If you're talking about scientific, if you're talking about things that you can test, things that you can verify, there is no test. I mean, if there were, you can bet your bottom dollar that people like Einstein wouldn't have said that there is no experiment that can prove whether the Earth moves or not. These are the kind of things that we've been trying to point out forever. And, I always point out that George Ellis, who's a main physicist, and I just have to bring him up all the time because he's the one that, said flat out to me, or in a quote, basically saying that, he can construct a spherically symmetrical universe with the Earth at its center. And he said, if you just take the Earth out of space and say it's now the center of everything, that you can never disprove that based on observations. So I said, wait a second. So they have this whole story of everything and how we're going around the sun and everything, but he's saying that you can do the same thing, just moving the Earth to its center, and you can't disprove it with observations. So what he's basically saying is observations can go either way. Either we're the center of the universe or we're this little random speck. And he says the only thing that we make our decision based on is on philosophical grounds. And he said that's something that a lot of cosmology tries to hide. That was his quote. And I said, hold on a second. So they're basing all of their observations, everything that they say they see, they're basing it on philosophical grounds. And then he says a lot of cosmology tries to hide that. So you've got a science, cosmology. It's the science of the sky, the science of where things came from and how they got here. And that is a science that tries to hide the fact that it gets its answers based on a worldview, on a philosophical idea, not based on observations. And yet people will go around and tell you, you don't know what you're talking about. The Earth definitely goes around the sun. And that's ridiculous because really, and then you can get into the whole idea of how every observation tells you that you are the center of the universe. You look around, everything's moving away from you. That tells you you're the center. So what did these guys do? They came up with other ideas like, well, if we were on a balloon and if you put a bunch of dots on a balloon and you blow up that balloon, all the dots move away from each other. Well, just because you can say that doesn't mean that it's right. But what did they do? They said that must be it. So they abandoned the idea that the Earth is the center, that everything seems to move away from us, that we seem to be of huge importance in this universe. They just went with the other idea because it fits their worldview. Their worldview is there is no God, that there is no creator, that everything here is an accident. So we need to learn that that's their worldview. Then everything that they present to us is going to be based on that worldview. That's why there's evolution. That's why there's 4.54 billion years that the earth has been here. That's why there has to be dinosaurs 67 million years ago. All these things have to be in order for their worldview to be true. So once you realize that, then you just start looking. And there's so many things that come up every day that we see that don't fit the worldview. And if they don't fit the worldview, they're discarded and they're called nonsense. I mean, I always talk about these, 10 scientists or paleontologists who found all these T-Rex bones and sent them to a lab to be tested. But they said, let's not tell the lab that they're dinosaur bones. Let's just send these fragments and see what happens. Well, they tested them all and they came back and said, oh, these are 8,000 years old, 10,000 years old. It was all between 8 and 11,000 years old. So then they got told, hey, guys, those were dinosaur bones. And the lab got all pissed and said, you're never allowed to send us anything again. We disregard these results. You guys are fooling with the system. Well, why? They were sending bones and they supposedly got tested by our testing facilities. And these facilities came back with, so are dinosaur bones really 10 to 11,000 years old? Or is the whole thing nonsense or what? But what's not true is that all these numbers that we get, oh, every dinosaur bone is 67 million years old. No, they're not. They're if they're told, hey, lab, these are some dinosaur bones. Can you run tests on them? Well, then they run a separate set of tests to make sure that they come back within the worldview. So it's always these things where, and I've talked about it before, they tested lava rock right after it came out of a volcano. It dried up. They tested it. It came back 30 million years old. Well, that's not true. That eruption just happened. Those rocks are literally 30 days old. They came out, but they come back. So when you start hearing these things, you just realize that anything that they tell you when it comes to dinosaurs, when it comes to the age of the earth, when it comes to these different layers, all the strata, right? The strata layers of the earth that they're able to test. Yet there's a tree that goes through the center of them all the way up. And yet all these layers are supposedly, hundreds of thousands of years, millions of years. You just start to realize that it comes down to worldviews. And that's what people fail to realize, is that these scientists are in that business. They got into it for a reason. They believe the things that they were taught, and you don't get anything for trying to disprove those things. It's just like Neil deGrasse said one time. He's like, oh, the great thing about science is we have peer review. And when somebody goes out and says something about evolution, then a bunch of scientists try to go out and disprove those. That's complete and total farce. No scientist goes out and tries to disprove evolution. There's no money in that. You wouldn't be allowed to do that. Right. You get rewarded when you find things that further that search for evolution, that prove it a little bit further, even though there is no evidence of any species ever changing into another species. So it's like, once you realize that, then you look at the whole thing. And that's why I'm glad at least Nathan's able to say that the one thing that's true is that he knows that it's not what they tell us. It's just, to me, it cannot be a spinning ball in outer space. And when I see the way that they've taught the world, the way that they've forced the globe down the throats of everyone and put it in every kid's bedroom and every movie and every commercial has it, and every logo and every brand name has a globe in it. They say global all the time. When I start to see all that, and then you realize that they were never told us about flat earth in school. They told us, oh, things would fall off the edge. Oh, the water would all rush off. They didn't try and get us to research it at all. Then I start to see why.
Right. And they would show us the disk in space, or the turn up, with the roots of the earth. We're all taught that the earth has a molten magnetic core, another impossibility, which is what's the depth? 4,000 miles to the center, something like that, Jaron. So the diameter of the earth, whatever it is, it's thousands of miles.
Yeah. Diameter would be
8,000 miles, something like that. But the deepest hole ever dug is just short of 8 miles. It's called the Great Borehole. And that's like the skin of an apple, on an apple. And on the way down, while they were digging, they used ground penetrating technology to see what they were going to be digging into. And they were wrong all the way down. At like 3 miles, they're like, all right, there's no more water. And then they hit water. Like, all right, there's no more big rocks. And then they hit big rocks. So they were wrong. Then they got to an impenetrable barrier. They could not get through it no matter what they did. And that's all we know. But now we have that cross section, which every kid, every adult knows exactly what it looks like. and it's all a religious speculation of nonsense.
Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, this is one of the things about flat Earth is it does get into a kind of a little of spirituality, and it did kind of for me too. Because when you look around, when you really observe things, it seems like we're at the center, right? It really does. It does seem like everything else is going around us, and there are a lot of things that are impossible if we're flying through space and everything else. Everything should be moving independently
Every day, every hour.
of each
Nathan,
other.
if you go out tonight, look up at the stars and chart where a couple key stars are in the sky, a couple constellations, whatever. And then a year from now, 10 years from now, at the same time, go out on the same night and look up. Those stars will be in the exact same space.
Right.
That should not happen
Right.
even after a day with all the movements that are going on.
Exactly. It's impossible. Like this,
yeah.
this is the thing about, that's the thing that gets to me is there's all this science, and I know like maybe Einstein thought he had things totally right. You know, I think he totally screwed up about gravity in particular, but maybe these people think they have it right. I don't know. Like, why can't they figure it out? Like, if we're moving and everything else is moving independently of each other, then how is it in exactly the same place, not just the next day, the next year, but over tens of thousands of years, it repeats exactly the same cycle. I mean, it shouldn't be possible to predict the movement of the stars.
It's not possible.
It shouldn't be, right? But yet we can, because they're in the same place all the time, you know? But
what is Einstein's greatest experiment?
What is Einstein's greatest experiment? I don't know that he did any.
Marrying his cousin?
He didn't do any. I mean, these are the things that we've come to believe is science. Is some guy who sat around with a piece of paper and tried to come up with a way to show that, you know, the Michelson-Morley experiment showed that we weren't moving, we weren't traveling through any. So he's like, okay, what do? I have to come up with this relativity idea. And it was just mathematics. And you can prove anything. I mean, you can show anything with pen and paper. That doesn't mean anything. And people have adopted that as proof. And, you know, we talk about all the time, you know, the sun is supposedly some 867,000 miles wide, which is stupid. I mean, there's just no other way to look at it. We all look up in the sky, we see it, and we're just told that it's 860. We can't imagine something that's 5 miles wide. You know, 10 miles wide. That's ridiculous. What's 10 miles wide? You know, some mountain range or something. Okay,
Nathan, the sun is a burning ball of hydrogen. It's so big. Like, if you had a Ziploc baggie filled with liquid hydrogen and you lit it on fire, would it burn for 1,000,000 years or 1,000,000,000 years evenly? No, it would explode. I mean, if it's a burning ball of hydrogen, it's going to explode. Forget gravity. Gravity's holding it together. And you know what I thought was the coolest thing growing up? That a photon in the middle of the sun would take thousands of years before it emerged at the surface and then travel to Earth. I mean, it's just, these are fantastic.
Not thousands of years too. I think they say it's millions.
Yeah, I was under exaggerating.
Right, which is hilarious because that's what Lawrence Krauss says is his proof to people that the Earth can't be 6,000 years old like the Bible says, is because he said, how could that be true if it takes light from the sun to get, it takes it 1,000,000 years to get from the center to the outside. Right. That's true. How could it possibly be true that the 1,000 years old? No, but about the sun real quick, you know, they say it's 867,000 miles wide and how far away it is. I mean, if you ask anybody how they ever got to that number, they have no idea. And when you look into it, it's because some guys on Earth looked up at Venus and said, well, let's pretend Venus is the same size as Earth. It's just a light in the sky. And they're like, let's pretend. And then they calculated it out. And then they came up with the distance of the sun. And it just so happened that when they sent probes there, they were right. That Venus happened to be the same size as the Earth. It's just hilarious. I mean, what would be the chances that you would be able to predict that? So stupid.
Right.